The last time when we read, we were introduced to Matilda, and she loved to read, even when she was like 4 or something. And it talked about how her dad would go to work and her brother would go to school and her mom would peace out and go to bingo every afternoon. So she would walk down to the library and read. And then we read about her dad who sold used cars, but he wasn't very honest about it, was he? He would turn back the mileage and he'd put sawdust in the engines so it would run smoother. And the last we read was they were all sitting in front of the TV sitting in front of the TV eating dinner. And Matilda had asked if she could go to the dining room so she could read her book. And her dad gave her a hard time about reading books. And he was really unkind to her. So she got mad and she decided that anytime one of her parents upsets her, she's going to get them back. So the next chapter is called come on, brain. There it is. The next chapter is called The Hat and the Superglue. Okay. Oh, I keep pushing the wrong buttons. I'm crazy. Okay. All right. Finally, I have it all set. Okay, so the third chapter is The Hat and the Superglue. The following morning, just before the father left for his beastly second-hand car garage, Matilda slipped into the cloakroom and got a hold of the hat he wore each day to work. She had to stand on her toes and reach up as high as she could with a walking stick in order to hook off the hat off the peg, and even then she only just made it. The hat itself was one of those flat-topped pork pie jobs with a jay's feather stuck in the hat band, and Mr. Wormwood was very proud of it. He thought it gave him a rakish, daring look, especially when he wore it at an angle with his loud checkered jacket and green tie. Matilda, holding the hat in one hand and a thin blue tube of superglue in the other, proceeded to squeeze a line of superglue very neatly all around the inside rim of the hat. Then she carefully hooked the hat back on the peg with the walking stick. She timed this operation very carefully, applying the glue just as her father was getting up from the breakfast table. Mr. Wormwood didn't notice anything when he put the hat on, but when he arrived at the garage, he couldn't get it off. Superglue is very powerful stuff. So powerful, it will take your skin off if you pull too hard. That's why you should never ever play with it. Mr. Wormwood didn't want to be scalped, so he had to keep his hat on his head the whole day long, even when putting sawdust in gearboxes and fiddling with the mileage of cars with his electric drill. In an effort to save face, he adopted a casual attitude, hoping that his staff would think he actually meant to keep his hat on all day long, just because he wanted to, like gangsters do in films. When he got home that evening, he still couldn't get the hat off. "Don't be silly," his wife said. "Come here, I'll take it off for you." She gave the hat a sharp yank. Mr. Wormwood let out a yell that rattled the window panes. "Ow!" he screamed. "Don't do that! Let go! You'll take half my skin off my forehead." Matilda, nestling in her usual chair, was watching this performance over the rim of her book with quite some interest. "What's the matter, Daddy?" she said. Has your head suddenly swollen or something?" The father glared at his daughter with deep suspicion, but said nothing. How could he? Mrs. Wormwood said to him, "It must be superglue. It couldn't be anything else. That'll teach you to go playing around with nasty stuff like that. I expect you were trying to stick another feather in your hat." "I haven't touched the stuff," Mr. Wormwood shouted. He turned and looked at Matilda again, who looked back at him with large, innocent brown eyes. Miss Wormwood said to him, "You should read the label on the tube before you start messing with dangerous products. Always follow the instructions on the label." What in heaven's name are you talking about, you stupid witch? Mr. Wormwood shouted, clutching the brim of his hat to stop anyone from trying to yank it off again. Do you think I'm so stupid that I'd glue this thing to my head on purpose? Matilda said, There's a boy down the road who got some superglue on his finger without knowing it, and then he put his finger up his nose. Mr. Wormwood jumped. What happened to him? He spluttered. Oh, well, the finger got stuck inside the nose, Matilda said, and then he had to go around like that for a week. People kept saying to him, Stop picking your nose, and he couldn't do anything about it. He looked an awful fool. Serves him right, Mrs. Wormwood said. He shouldn't have put his finger up there in the first place. It's a nasty habit. If all children had superglue put on their fingers, they'd soon stop doing it. Matilda said, Grown-ups do it too, Mummy. I saw you doing it yesterday in the kitchen. That is quite enough from you, Mrs. Wormwood said, turning pink. Mr. Wormwood had to keep his hat on all through supper in front of the television, and he looked ridiculous, and he stayed very silent. When he went up to bed, he again tried to get the thing off, and so did his wife, but it wouldn't budge. How am I going to have my shower? He demanded. Well, you'll just have to do without one, won't you? His wife told him. And later on, as she watched her skinny little husband sulking around the bedroom in his purple striped pajamas, with a pork pie hat on his head, she thought how stupid he looked. Hardly the kind of man a wife dreams about, she told herself. Mr. Wormwood discovered that the worst thing about having a permanent hat on his head was having to sleep in it. It was impossible to lie comfortably on his pillow. Now do stop fussing around, his wife said to him after he'd been tossing and turning for about an hour. I expect it will be loose by the morning, and then it'll slip off easily. But it wasn't loose by the morning, and it definitely would not slip off. So Mrs. Wormwood took a pair of scissors and cut the thing off his head, bit by bit, first the top and then the rim. Where the inner band had stuck to the hair all around the sides and the back, she had to chop the hair off right to the skin so that he finished up with a bald white ring around his head, like some sort of monk. And in the front, where the band had been stuck directly to his bare skin, there remained a whole lot of small patches of brown leathery stuff that no amount of washing would take off. At breakfast, Matilda said to him, You must try to get those bits off your forehead, Daddy. It looks as though you've got little brown insects crawling about all over you. People will think you've got lice. Be quiet, the father snapped. Just keep your nasty mouth shut, will you? All in all, it was the most satisfactory of experiences, but it was surely too much to hope that it had taught her father a permanent lesson. Ooh, his parents are nasty, aren't they? Yikes. So, chapter 3, I guess the chapters are kind of short, huh? Chapter 3 is called The Ghost. There was comparative calm in the Wormwood household for about a week after the superglue episode. The experience had clearly chastened Mr. Wormwood, and he seemed temporarily to have lost his taste for boasting and bullying. But then suddenly, he struck again. Perhaps he had had a bad day at the garage and not sold enough crummy second-hand cars. There are many things that make a man irritable when he arrives home from work in the evening, and a sensible wife will usually notice the storm signals and leave him alone until he simmers down. When Mr. Wormwood arrived back from the garage that evening, his face was as dark as a thundercloud, and somebody was clearly for the high jump pretty soon. That's a weird phrase. His wife recognized the sign immediately and made herself scarce. He then strode into the living room. Matilda happened to be curled up in the armchair in the corner, totally absorbed in her book. Mr. Wormwood switched on the television. The screen lit up. The program blared. Mr. Wormwood glared at Matilda. She hadn't moved. She had somehow trained herself by now to block her ears to the ghastly sound of the dreaded box. She kept right on reading, and for some reason this infuriated her father. Perhaps his anger was intensified because he saw her getting pleasure from something that was beyond his own reach. Do you ever stop reading? He snapped at her. Oh, "Hello, Daddy," she said pleasantly. "Did you have a good day?" "What is this trash?" he said, snatching the book up from her hands. "It isn't trash, Daddy. It's lovely. It's called The Red Pony. It's by John Steinbeck, an American writer. Why don't you try it? You'll love it." "Filth," Mr. Wormwood said. "If it's by an American, it's certain to be filth. That's all they write about." "No, Daddy, it's beautifully. Honestly, it's about—" "I don't want to know what it's about," Mr. Wormwood barked. "I'm fed up with your reading anyway. Go and find yourself something useful to do." With frightening sadness, with frightening suddenness, he now began to rip the pages out of the book in handfuls, throwing them in the waste paper basket. Matilda froze in horror. The father kept going. There seemed to be little doubt that the man felt some kind of jealousy. How dare she, he seemed to be saying with each rip of a page. How dare she enjoy reading books when he couldn't? How dare she? "That's a library book," Matilda cried. "It doesn't belong to me. I have to turn it to Miss Phelps." "Then you'll have to buy another one, won't you?" the father said, still tearing out pages. "You'll have to save your pocket money until there's enough in the kitty to buy a new one for your precious Mrs. Phelps, won't you?" With that, he dropped the now empty covers of the book into the basket and marched out of the room, leaving the telly blaring. Most children, in Matilda's place, would have burst into floods of tears, and she didn't do this. She sat there, very still and white and thoughtful. She seemed to know that neither crying nor sulking ever got anyone anywhere. The only sensible thing to do when you are attacked is, as Napoleon once said, to counterattack. Matilda's wonderfully subtle mind was already at work devising yet another suitable punishment for her poisonous parents. The plan that was now beginning to hatch in her mind depended, however, upon whether or not Fred's parrot really was as good of a talker as Fred said that he was. Fred was a friend of Matilda's. He was a small boy of 6 who lived just around the corner from her, and for days he had been going on and on about his great talking parrot that his father had given him. So the following afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Wormwood had departed in her car for another session of bingo, Matilda set out for Fred's house to investigate. She knocked on his door and asked if he would mind, or if he would be kind enough to show her the famous bird. Fred was delighted and led her up to his bedroom, where a truly magnificent blue and yellow parrot sat in a tall cage. "There it is," Fred said. "His name is Chopper." "Oh, make it talk," Matilda said. "Well, you can't make it talk," Fred said. "You have to be patient. He'll talk when he feels like it." They hung around waiting, and suddenly the parrot said, "Hello, hello, hello." Sounded exactly like a human voice. Matilda said, "That's amazing. What else can it say?" "Rattle my bones," the parrot said, giving a wonderful imitation of a spooky voice. "Rattle my bones." "He's always saying that," Fred told her. "What else can he say?" Matilda asked. "Well, that's about it," Fred said. "But it's pretty marvelous, don't you think?" "It's fabulous," Matilda said. "Will you lend him to me, just for one night?" "No," Fred said. "Certainly not. I'll give you all my next week's pocket money," Matilda said. Now that was different. Fred thought about it for a few seconds. "All right, then," he said, "if you promise to return him tomorrow." Matilda staggered back to her own empty house, carrying the tall cage in both hands. There was a large fireplace in the dining room, and she now set about wedging the cage up the chimney and out of sight. This wasn't so easy, but she managed it in the end. "Hello, hello, hello," the bird called down to her. "Hello, hello." "Oh, shush, you nut," Matilda said, and she went out to wash the soot off her hands. That evening, while the mother, father, and brother, and Matilda were having supper, as usual, in the living room in front of the television, a voice came loud and clear from the dining room across the hall. "Hello, hello, hello," it said. "Harry!" cried the mother, turning white. "There's someone in the house! I heard a voice." "So did I," the brother said. Matilda jumped up and switched off the telly. Shh, she said. Listen. They all stopped eating and sat very tense, listening. Hello, 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 came the voice again. There it is, cried the brother. Burglars, hissed the mother. They're in the dining room. I think they are, the father said, sitting tight. Well, then go and catch them, Harry, hissed the mother. Go out and collar them red-handed. The father didn't move. He seemed in no hurry to dash off to be a hero. His face had turned gray. Oh, get on with it, hissed the mother. They're probably after the silver. The husband wiped his lips nervously with his napkin. Why don't we all go together? He said. Well, come on, then, the brother said. Come on, Mum. They're definitely in the dining room, Matilda whispered. I'm sure they are. The mother grabbed a poker from the fireplace. The father took a golf club that was standing in the corner. The brother seized a table lamp, ripping the plug out of the socket, and Matilda took a knife she had been eating with, and all four of them crept in towards the dining room, the father keeping well behind the others in the back. Hello, 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 came the voice again. Come on, Matilda cried, and she burst into the room, brandishing her knife. Stick 'em up, she yelled. We've got you! The others followed her, waving their weapons. Then they stopped. They stared around the room. Well, there was no one there. There's no one here, the father said, greatly relieved. I heard him, Harry, the mother shrieked, still quaking. I distinctly heard his voice. So did you. I'm certain that I heard him, Mamma, Matilda cried. He's in here somewhere. She began searching behind the sofa and behind the curtains. Then came the voice once again, soft and spooky this time. Rattle my bones, it said. Rattle my bones. They all jumped, including Matilda, who was a pretty good actress. They stared around the room, and there was still no one there. It's a ghost, Matilda said. Oh, heaven help us, cried the mother, clutching her husband around the neck. I know it's a ghost, Matilda said. I've heard it here before. This room is haunted. I thought you knew that. Oh, save us, the mother screamed, almost throttling her husband now. I'm getting out of here, the father said, grayer than ever now. They all fled, slamming the door behind them. The next afternoon, Matilda managed to get a rather sooty and grumpy parrot down from the chimney and out of the house without being seen. She carried it through the back door and ran with it all the way to Fred's house. Did it behave itself? Fred asked her. Oh, we had a lovely time with it, Matilda said. My parents just adored it. Okay, so that is 2 chapters.